Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today, we're diving into Frederick Copleston's Volume 4 Modern Philosophy, From Descartes to Leibniz, a deep dive into a period where philosophy started shifting, from a focus on God to a focus on reason and science.
It's interesting, though, because it wasn't a complete break from theology. Descartes, often considered the father of modern philosophy, still very much wanted his philosophical ideas to jive with Catholic dogma.
So how do we make sense of that? It seems a bit contradictory.
Think of it this way. Medieval philosophers, like Aquinas, were first and foremost theologians. Their philosophical ideas were essentially grounded in their theological beliefs. But with Descartes, we see a shift. He was a philosopher first, and that reflects a changing intellectual landscape.
So it's a subtle shift in emphasis.
Yeah.
But with major implications.
Yeah. Right.
It's like the ground was shifting under everyone's feet.
Exactly. And out of this shift, we see the emergence of two major schools of thought, rationalism and empiricism.
Okay. Let's break those down. What's the difference?
Rationalism, championed by thinkers like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, believed that reason is the primary source of knowledge. Think of Descartes' famous, "I think, therefore I am." It perfectly sums up the rationalist mindset. Our ability to reason is proof of our existence and the foundation of knowledge. Spinoza took this even further, arguing that God and nature are one substance. Then there's Leibniz, who blew everyone's minds with his theory of monads.
Hold on, monads? That sounds wild. What are those?
Imagine the universe made of these tiny, self-contained units, each one reflecting the entire universe but unable to interact, kind of like billions of tiny mirrors, each holding a complete image but existing in complete isolation. That's Leibniz's idea of monads.
Wow. Okay, so that's rationalism. What about empiricism? Weren't those folks all about sensory experience?
Precisely. Empiricists like Locke, Berkeley, and Hume argued that knowledge comes from our senses, our experiences of the world. Locke, for example, rejected the idea of innate ideas, believing our minds are blank slates at birth. Berkeley went even further, claiming that to be is to be perceived, meaning things only exist if they are perceived by a mind.
So for Berkeley, reality is all about perception. That's trippy.
It is. And then we have Hume, the ultimate skeptic, who questioned the very basis of cause and effect, and basically shook the foundations of scientific knowledge.
So basically, two very different ways of looking at the world. It sounds like these opposing viewpoints would have led to some heated debates.
Absolutely. These debates about the nature of reality, knowledge, and understanding continue even to this day. And Copleston does a great job exploring these themes in his book. For example, he dives into the mind-body problem, which Descartes really brought to the forefront with his theory of dualism.
The mind-body problem. That's a classic. Refresh my memory on that one.
Descartes believed that the mind and body are two distinct substances. The mind being non-physical, and the body being physical.
Right.
Somehow exist independently.
Right. But if they're separate, how do they interact? How can my thoughts control my physical actions? That seems like a real head-scratcher.
Exactly. And that's the challenge of dualism. It leads to all sorts of mind-bending theories, like occasionalism, where God is constantly stepping in to make sure the mind and body work together.
So basically, God is playing puppeteer with our bodies. That's wild.
It is. And it raises even more questions about free will. If God is orchestrating everything, do we really have any choice in our actions?
Okay, so we've got the mind-body problem and the question of free will. What other big themes does Copleston explore?
Well, he also delves into the rise of political philosophy during this period. Thinkers like Hobbes and Spinoza started applying philosophical principles to understand things like government power and the idea of a social contract.
So basically, trying to figure out how to live together and govern ourselves based on these new ideas about human nature and the world.
Exactly. And Copleston even touches on the Relly philosophy of history. Thinkers like Vico and Herder began to see history not just as a collection of facts and dates, but as a process of development and evolution. It's the beginning of thinking about our place in the grand scheme of things.
It's amazing how these ideas, centuries old, still resonate today. They're like the building blocks of modern thought. But there's one figure Copleston keeps coming back to who seems like a real game changer. Immanuel Kant.
Kant. He's a titan in the world of philosophy. Copleston argues that Kant's work marks a turning point, a culmination of all these ideas swirling around in the 17th and 18th centuries. His critical philosophy tries to bridge the gap between rationalism and empiricism, laying the groundwork for 19th century German idealism.
He sounds like a fascinating figure. I'm definitely curious to learn more.
Oh, unfortunately. Kant's work falls outside the scope of this particular volume, but his influence on modern thought is undeniable.
So that's something to explore in another deep dive, maybe.
Absolutely. There's always more to uncover, more layers to peel back.
Well, we've already covered a lot of ground today. It's incredible how much these thinkers were grappling with. But let's be real, we've only scratched the surface of what Copleston has to offer.
He really does a deep dive into each of these philosophers and their ideas.
Exactly. And if you're fascinated by the evolution of Western thought and the big questions that have shaped our understanding of the world, I highly encourage you to check out Copleston's book for yourself.
It's a challenging read, but incredibly rewarding.
Absolutely. It's called Vol. 4 Modern Philosophy, From Descartes to Leibniz by Frederick Copleston. We'll be sure to include a link in the show notes where you can purchase it. And hey, while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our future deep dives. We've got a lot more exciting philosophical adventures in store.
There's always something new to learn, something new to ponder.
Yeah.
You know, it's fascinating how these groundbreaking philosophical systems still relied on concepts from medieval thought, like take the concept of substance, for example.
Substance. Okay, remind me what that refers to again.
Essentially, substance refers to the underlying reality of something, what it's made of at its core. It played a central role in the philosophies of Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, but each interpreted it differently. Descartes, for example, linked material substance with geometrical extension, which was a new idea. Leibniz, on the other hand, saw substance as more of a dynamic force.
So they were building on old ideas, but giving them a new spin, kind of adapting them to their own philosophy.
Exactly. And we see a similar trend with the idea of God. While God is a key part of their systems, there's a noticeable shift in how they understood creation. Spinoza, for instance, argued that the world emanates from God out of necessity, almost like blurring the lines between the creator and creation.
It sounds like they were wrestling with how to reconcile reason with their traditional beliefs about God.
Absolutely. And this tension is especially evident in Descartes' work. Remember his quest for absolute certainty. It wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was driven by a need to find a solid foundation for knowledge, one that could withstand skeptical challenges.
So he was like, okay, let's start from scratch. How do we know anything for sure?
Exactly. And his starting point was his own existence. That famous, I think, therefore I am, wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was the bedrock of his entire system. He argued that even if we doubt everything else, we can't doubt our own existence as thinking beings.
It's like that moment when you realize, whoa, I'm thinking, therefore I must exist. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. And from that foundation, he set out to prove the existence of God, but in a way that was very different from traditional theological arguments.
How so? What made his approach unique?
Well, instead of relying on external evidence or appeals to authority, Descartes looked inward. He argued that the very idea of a perfect being, an idea that we have as imperfect beings, implies the existence of God.
So he's saying that our very concept of God points to God's reality.
Precisely. And this argument, while controversial, highlights the rationalist emphasis on the power of reason to uncover truths about the world and even about God.
It's a fascinating line of thinking. But I know Descartes is also famous for his ideas about the mind and body, specifically his theory of dualism.
Oh, absolutely. Dualism was a major part of his philosophy, and it had a huge impact on subsequent thinkers. But as we talked about earlier, it leads to that tricky question, if the mind and body are separate, how do they interact?
Right. It's like, how can something non-physical control something physical? It seems impossible.
It does. And Descartes himself didn't fully explain how this interaction occurs. Some of his followers, like Jelinx, came up with the theory of occasionalism, suggesting that God is the intermediary coordinating every interaction between mind and body.
So basically, every time I move my arm, it's actually God making it happen. That's a wild idea.
It is. But it raises even more questions about free will. If God is constantly stepping in, do we really have any autonomy? Are we just puppets in God's cosmic play?
It's a mind-boggling concept. It seems like the more you dig into these philosophical systems, the more questions you uncover.
Yeah.
But didn't Descartes also have some interesting ideas about the physical world, like in the realm of physics?
Yeah, he did. He was very much influenced by the scientific revolution happening around him, and he tried to apply his philosophical principles to understanding the natural world. He even developed his own laws of motion based on the idea of a mechanistic universe.
So he saw the universe as a giant machine governed by predictable laws.
Essentially, yes. He believed that the universe was created by God with a certain amount of motion, and that this motion is constantly being redistributed among bodies, but the total amount always stays the same.
It's interesting to see how his philosophical ideas about God influenced his scientific thinking.
It shows how interconnected these different areas of knowledge were for these early modern thinkers. They were trying to create these grand comprehensive systems that could explain everything. Of course, some of their ideas, like Descartes' specific laws of motion, have been superseded by later scientific discoveries.
But even if the specifics weren't always right, it's their overall approach that paved the way for modern science. That spirit of inquiry and the search for fundamental laws of nature.
Absolutely. And their attempts to connect physics with metaphysics, while not always successful, demonstrate the incredible ambition of these thinkers. They weren't afraid to tackle the big questions, the really fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, freedom, and God.
It's those big questions that make their work still relevant today. They were grappling with issues that we continue to struggle with centuries later.
Exactly. Their ideas continue to challenge us, to make us think differently about ourselves and the world. And speaking of challenging ideas, Copleston introduces us to another fascinating figure who took a very different approach, Blaise Pascal.
Pascal the mathematician. Wasn't he a bit of a skeptic when it came to the power of reason?
Pascal was a unique figure, a brilliant mathematician and scientist. He was also deeply religious and a critic of the purely rationalist approach to faith.
So he was kind of a rebel in the philosophical world.
You could say that he challenged the idea that reason alone could lead us to God. Instead, he emphasized the importance of faith, intuition, and the human heart.
It sounds like he was tapping into something deeper than just logic and reason, something more experiential and emotional.
Exactly. He believed there are certain truths that can only be grasped through faith and experienced truths that go beyond the limits of rational analysis.
I'm starting to see why he's considered such a complex and intriguing figure. But didn't Pascal also have a rather pessimistic view of human nature?
Uh-huh.
I vaguely remember something about that.
He did. He had a very realistic understanding of human limitations, our flaws, and the power of our emotions and desires. He argued that we're inherently imperfect and prone to error. But for him, this wasn't a cause for despair. He believed that our very weakness is what makes us open to grace and the need for God.
So it's like our imperfections are actually a pathway to something greater, something beyond ourselves.
Exactly. Pascal's philosophy is this fascinating blend of reason, faith, and a profound understanding of the human condition. And his insights into the limits of reason and the power of the heart are still relevant today. They challenge us to think about the different ways we can approach knowledge and truth.
It's amazing how Copleston manages to weave together these different perspectives, showing the richness and diversity of thought during this period.
It's a testament to his skill as a historian of philosophy. He doesn't just present a dry account of facts and figures. He brings these thinkers to life, showing us how they wrestled with fundamental questions and shaped the intellectual landscape of their time.
Speaking of which, we're starting to run out of time for this particular deep dive, but there's still so much to explore.
There is. We haven't even touched upon figures like Malebranche and Spinoza, who offer even more unique and thought-provoking perspectives on the ideas we've been discussing.
It sounds like we'll have to save them for another episode, perhaps a part 3 of our exploration of this era. But for now.
So, as we kind of wrap up exploring this era, we find another figure grappling with that tension between rationalism and empiricism, Nicolas Malebranche.
Malebranche.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not as famous as Descartes or Pascal, but definitely curious to hear more. What made his philosophy unique?
Well, Malebranche was like super devout Christian and a follower of Descartes, but he took Descartes' ideas in a very God-centered direction. He believed that we see all things in God.
Wait, we see everything in God? That's a pretty bold claim. How did he get there?
So Malebranche argued that our minds are finite, right? They're limited in what they can grasp, especially when it comes to the infinite nature of things. Mm. And then the question becomes, how do we perceive anything at all? And his answer is God being omniscient and omnipresent, holds all the archetypal ideas of all things within himself.
So it's almost like God's mind is this cosmic library. And when we perceive something, we're actually just accessing its representation in God's mind.
That's a fantastic analogy. Yeah, Malebranche believed we're not directly perceiving the object itself, but its idea in the mind of God.
Wow, that's a pretty radical way of understanding perception. Doesn't that lead him to some unusual conclusions?
It did. For example, he argued that there's no direct causal interaction between the mind and body. He was a proponent of occasionalism. That idea that God is the ultimate cause of everything. What we perceive as cause and effect is really just God making things happen.
So every time I decide to move my arm, it's actually God making it happen. So does that mean we don't have free will?
That's a question that Malebranche really struggled with. He wanted to maintain human freedom while also upholding God's absolute power. Essentially, he argued that God grants us freedom, but within the framework of his divine plan.
So we have limited freedom, but ultimately God is in control.
Yeah, it's a complex and fascinating idea. Malebranche definitely pushed the boundaries of rationalism.
He did. And his emphasis on God's role in perception and causality really kind of paves the way for later idealist philosophers who questioned the very existence of a material world independent of the mind.
It's incredible how these thinkers were constantly pushing the envelope, coming up with new ways of understanding ourselves and the universe. But we can't forget the philosophical giant who stands at the end of this era, Spinoza. Spinoza. A truly radical and fascinating face. While Descartes and Malebranche were trying to reconcile reason with traditional beliefs, Spinoza took a more uncompromising approach. He developed a system of pantheism identifying God with nature.
Pantheism. So he's saying that God and nature are one and the same.
Exactly. Spinoza argued that there's only one substance which he called God, or nature. Everything else, including our minds and bodies, are just modifications of this one substance.
So instead of God who's separate from the world, he's saying that God is within everything, permeating all of reality.
Precisely. And this led him to some pretty radical conclusions. For example, he denied the existence of free will, arguing that everything is determined by the laws of nature, which are ultimately the laws of God.
So no room for chance or choice in Spinoza's universe. Everything is predetermined.
That's right. He saw the universe as a perfectly ordered system unfolding according to its own internal logic.
That's a bold and somewhat unsettling view. No wonder he was considered a controversial figure in his time.
He definitely challenged the status quo. His philosophy questioned traditional religious beliefs and sparked a lot of debate. But even his critics couldn't deny the power and elegance of his system.
Yeah, Spinoza's philosophy adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of this era. It highlights the diversity of thought and the willingness to push boundaries that characterize this period.
Absolutely. From Descartes' quest for certainty to Spinoza's pantheistic vision, these thinkers offer a rich tapestry of ideas that have shaped Western thought. They grappled with questions about reality knowledge, the mind-body problem freedom, and the nature of God questions that we still wrestle with today.
It's been an incredible journey exploring this pivotal era in philosophy. These thinkers have expanded our understanding of the world and our place in it. And while we've covered a lot of ground, we've really only scratched the surface of Copleston's insightful analysis.
He really goes into much greater depth on each of these philosophers, unpacking their ideas with nuance and clarity.
If you're intrigued by the evolution of Western thought, the big questions that have shaped our understanding of ourselves and the universe, I highly recommend checking out Copleston's Vol for Modern Philosophy, From Descartes to Leibniz.
Yeah, it's a challenging but rewarding read that will deepen your appreciation for the history of ideas.
Absolutely. We'll include a link to purchase the book in the show notes. And hey, while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our future deep dives into the fascinating world of philosophy. Until next time, keep those minds curious.